Dear students, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Manzoor Ahmad, lecturer in history. Our today's question for 11th class students of history subject is: what were the benefits of the winds of change to the natives of Australia? Dear students, as we have seen, the people from different European countries, especially from England, reached to America, especially North America, and colonized it, and then became the permanent residents, made this North America as the permanent living place for them. Similarly, these Europeans, especially the people from England, reached Australia in the 18th century, and after establishing different colonies in Australia, these people from England, they displaced the Australian natives who were already living in different parts of Australia. So after forcing these Australian natives to get displaced from their original places, which were occupied by the Europeans and established colonies there, these natives were forced to get displaced and move out to forest and rural areas. And after in the 19th century, we understand that in the 20th century we understand that a government was formed in Australia, and in the government the maximum participation was of the people who had settled in Australia from Europe, from England. So the government formation in the Australia was made by the settlers who had settled in Australia in the 19th century. And when the government formation was made, in the government formation, the natives of Australia who had been thrown out to forest and rural areas, these natives had no place, no right, and no say in the administrative, political, and economic affairs of Australia, as was the case of the natives of America who had thrown out of their homes, of their original lands, to the forest areas and rural areas by the Europeans who settled there. In the same way, when these Europeans reached Australia, they made different areas of Australia their homeland, and forced the Australian natives to move out of their mainland and forced them to move out to the forest and the rural areas. And when the government in Australia began to shape in the 20th century, the government formation was made by these European settlers who settled there, and the natives of Australia were given no place in the economic, in the political, in the administrative system of the Australia. However, in the 20th century, the winds of change began to flow, means that changes began to take place in the Australian government, wherein rights were restored to the Australian natives, and the system of restoring or giving back the rights to the Australian natives is known as winds of change. This winds of change, this began to blow in favor of the Australian natives in the 20th century. And now in this question we have to see, when the winds of change means when the rights of the Australian natives begin to be restored, how these winds of change benefited the natives of Australia. Dear students, the winds of change helped the Australian natives in different ways. Number one, the famous books like The Great Australian Silence by W.E.H. Steiner and Why Were Not We Told by Henry Reynolds prompted and made Europeans to understand the Australia's bright past in a right perspective. Dear students, we know that these European settlers in Australia had deliberately left the history of the Australian natives out of history books and tried to project them in all bad colors. But the two great writers, namely W.E.H. Steiner, he wrote a book, The Great Australian Silence, and Henry Reynolds, who wrote a book, Why Were Not We Told. These two books highlighted the bright aspects of the Australian natives, highlighted the efficiency, ability, and capability of the Australian natives which they had when Europeans had not reached there. So when the Europeans came to know about the qualities and know about the bright past of the Australian natives, these Europeans in Australia, the Australian government began to recognize the rights, began to recognize the capabilities of these Australian natives, and the Australian government began to give various kinds of rights. Various kinds of rights were given. Various kinds of political, administrative, economic rights were begin to be given to these Australian natives from time to time, especially in the 20th century. Number two, in 1974, the Australian government adopted the policy of multiculturalism. The policy of multiculturalism aimed at giving equal status and respect to the cultures of the natives of Australia, to the culture of the Europeans, and to the culture of other Asian immigrants who had come to this Australia from time to time. Means now, after 1974, before 1974, we can say the culture of Australian natives, which was considered backward, which was considered present in all bad colors, projected in all bad colors. But after 1974, the British government, the Australian government established the policy of multiculturalism, according to which the culture of the Australian natives was given due respect, was given as respect as was given to the European cultures or to other Asian cultures in Australia. Number three, Judith Wright, a great Australian poetess, launched a movement for the rights of the natives in Australia, and this movement also proved fruitful and helped Australians to get a number of rights. Australian natives to get a number of rights from the Australian government. Number four, in 1992, the Australian High Court declared the policy of terra nullius invalid. According to the policy of terra nullius, no one in Australia had a right over a particular piece of land, especially the Australian natives. But in 1992, the Australian High Court declared this policy of terra nullius invalid, and this verdict of Australian High Court made Australian government recognize the claims of natives over different areas of land in Australia, which before 1992 were not recognized at all. So we can say the winds of change were very much fruitful for the Australian natives, and these winds of change helped Australian natives get their rights restored back and get the due place in the Australian society which they deserved. Thank you.